Welcome to Revenge Flame. Get ready for a wild story from Rhode Island. On the night of my father's 60th birthday celebration, my older sister planned to publicly humiliate me as the family failure. My name is Riley. I am 28 years old, and this is how I turned her cruel trap into my greatest victory. The rhythmic whirring of my pottery wheel was the only sound I wanted to hear that afternoon, because it always brought me a deep sense of peace. That comfortable silence was suddenly shattered by the shrill ringing of my phone echoing loudly against the brick walls of my studio. I wiped the thick layer of wet clay from my hands onto my canvas apron before picking up the device to see a name I had not seen in over a year. It was my older sister who had completely cut me off when I refused to follow our father's strict career path. The message flashing on the screen was dripping with her usual arrogance and read simply, "Come. Let's see who Dad is really proud of." It was a malicious challenge from a woman who had spent her entire life stepping on me to elevate herself in our father's eyes. A younger version of myself might have cried at such a blatant attempt to belittle me, but I was no longer that fragile girl she remembered. I stared at the invitation to my father's 60th birthday party with a faint smile on my lips, instead of tears in my eyes. She wanted me there to serve as a pathetic backdrop for her success, but she had absolutely no idea what I had achieved during our time apart. I typed a brief reply to confirm my attendance because I was finally ready to face them. Tonight was not going to go the way she planned, because the discarded child was coming home to reveal the truth, alongside a guest who would silence them forever. If you enjoy stories about underdogs standing up to arrogant family members, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more satisfying justice. 1 year ago, the heavy oak door of the family estate slammed shut in my face with a finality that shook the very ground beneath my feet, carrying with it the freezing rain of that miserable night. The echo of that impact was the only response to the terrifying scene that had just unfolded inside my father's study, where my dreams were systematically destroyed. I could still hear the sickening crunch of fired clay shattering against the marble floor as my father Douglas hurled my delicate vases across the room in a fit of uncontrollable rage. He screamed until his face turned crimson that I was a disgrace to the family name because I refused to waste my life studying business administration like he demanded. Douglas looked at the shards of my hard work scattered around his expensive leather shoes with pure disgust before telling me to get out of his house and never return until I learned how to make real money. I found myself standing on the street corner shivering violently while the icy water soaked through my thin jacket until my best friend Chloe pulled up in her battered sedan to rescue me from the storm. She was the only person who answered my call that night, and she immediately cleared off her cramped sofa to give me a place to sleep without asking a single judgmental question. The next few weeks were a blur of desperation as I scrambled to find a way to survive without the financial safety net I had known my entire life. I refused to let Douglas win by crawling back to him, so I used the very last of my savings to secure a lease on a dilapidated warehouse on the edge of town that smelled of rust and damp wood. That dusty space became both my sanctuary and my battleground as I worked 18 hours a day to prove that my art had value beyond what my narrow-minded family could understand. It was during one of those exhausting afternoons while I was covered in gray dust and frustration that a handsome stranger walked through the creaky metal doors looking for custom dinnerware. That was how I met my boyfriend Julian when he wandered in, claiming he needed unique plates for a project he was keeping under wraps. Julian seemed fascinated by the way I shaped the clay, often staying for hours just to watch the process, or to help me carry heavy boxes of raw materials from the delivery truck. He never once mentioned his financial status during those early months, preferring to help me sand shelves and pack shipments like a regular partner rather than a wealthy patron. I fell in love with him because he believed in my vision when everyone else saw only a stubborn girl playing in the mud. He celebrated every small victory with me, from the first completed order to the moment we finally installed a proper heating system in the studio. Julian eventually revealed that he was developing a boutique hotel chain, but he remained incredibly humble about the scale of his success and simply insisted that my work deserved a global audience. We built this life together brick by brick, creating a world where respect and support were the foundation rather than manipulation and control. Bringing my mind back to the present moment inside my successful studio, I watched Julian pick up the cream-colored envelope from the table to examine the calligraphy. He read the invitation to the birthday party with a calm expression that did not betray the sharp intelligence gleaming in his eyes. He knew exactly how much Douglas had hurt me because he had held me through the nightmares and the tears during that first difficult year. Julian placed the card back on the table with deliberate slowness before looking at me with a smile that was both protective and dangerous. He walked over to where I was standing and wiped a smudge of clay from my cheek with his thumb. He told me softly that it was time we accepted the invitation, because he had a few things he wanted to discuss with the man who threw his daughter out into the rain. Julian said he thought it was time we showed them exactly who was holding the real power now. 2 days before the party, my phone screen lit up repeatedly with a barrage of demanding and unreasonable requirements that could only come from one person. My sister Stella seemed determined to micromanage every single aspect of my appearance from miles away because she was terrified I would embarrass her in front of her high society friends. Her messages were a constant stream of aggression regarding the mandatory gold color scheme she had imposed for the evening to ensure the event looked expensive in the photos. One particular text stood out for its cruelty as she wrote, "Don't wear those clothes covered in mud that you usually wear because you will make the whole family look bad." I read her insults with a calmness that would have infuriated her, while I sketched a design for something that would outshine anything she could purchase off a rack. I refused to rent a gaudy gown covered in designer logos, like Stella expected me to do, because I wanted to wear something that represented my own identity as a successful artist. I commissioned a local seamstress to create a floor-length dress made of liquid silk in a shade of antique gold that shimmered like molten metal under the light. It was a masterpiece of quiet luxury that spoke of refined taste rather than the desperate need for validation that consumed my sister. When I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my bedroom to check the fit, I saw a woman who had built an empire from dust rather than a girl who was begging for scraps of approval. The fabric draped perfectly over my frame to create a silhouette that was both elegant and commanding, proving that I did not need their money to look like I belonged in a palace. The drive to Newport was smooth and quiet as we glided along the coast in Julian's sleek black sedan, while the ocean view rushed past the tinted windows. I felt a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach at the thought of seeing Douglas again after he had so violently rejected me. Julian sensed my tension immediately and reached over the center console to cover my hand with his own, to offer a silent reassurance that grounded me. He kept his eyes on the winding road ahead, but his expression was serious when he finally broke the silence to discuss the real reason he was so eager to attend this specific event. Julian told me that my brother-in-law Travis had been frantically trying to secure a meeting with him for weeks to ask for a massive capital injection. I looked at Julian with surprise, because I had assumed the family business was doing well, given the lavish party they were throwing for Douglas. Julian reached into the leather bag on the back seat and handed me a thick blue folder stamped with the logo of my father's company. He told me with a grim expression that, "Travis has submitted this to my executive assistant 5 times already, but the numbers inside are completely fake." I opened the heavy file to scan the financial reports that were supposed to represent the company I had been told was thriving under Stella and Travis's leadership. The columns were filled with inflated projections and concealed debts that painted a picture of a business on the absolute brink of collapse. I realized with a sudden jolt of clarity that the wealthy facade my family presented to the world was nothing more than a hollow shell waiting to crack under the slightest pressure. The data showed that they had leveraged the company assets to fund their personal lifestyles while neglecting the core operations that Douglas had built decades ago. Julian glanced at me as I turned the pages, and he explained that they are looking for a savior because the banks have finally stopped lending them money. I looked at the desperate signatures of Travis and Douglas on the loan applications and felt a strange shift in my perspective. The fear I had felt about facing them began to evaporate into a strange sense of pity because they were drowning while pretending to swim. I closed the folder and placed it back on the seat as the iron gates of the Newport estate came into view at the end of the long driveway. Julian squeezed my hand one last time and promised me that by the end of the night everyone would know exactly what the dossier contained. We were not walking into the lion's den as victims because we were holding the keys to their destruction in our hands. The atmosphere of the party at the historic Newport mansion reeked of money, with towering champagne pyramids and melodious chamber music filling the humid air of the grand ballroom. I stepped through the massive double doors alone while Julian took a moment to handle the valet parking situation outside because we had agreed he would make a separate entrance for maximum impact. The moment my heels clicked against the polished marble floor of the entryway, I felt the immediate and suffocating weight of 100 judgment-filled eyes turning in my direction. These were the same social elites who had watched me grow up in the shadow of my family, and their whispers traveled behind fan-covered mouths like venomous snakes, slithering through the grass. I held my head high, despite the intense scrutiny, because I knew that the woman they were judging no longer existed, but their stares still carried the sharp sting of rejection. It did not take long for the first predator to spot me in the open, as Stella descended upon me with the speed and predatory focus of a vulture, spotting a fresh carcass on the roadside. She was dressed in a sequined gold gown that looked more like a costume than formal wear, and her eyes raked over my handmade silk dress with obvious jealousy masked as disdain. She stopped aggressively close to my face to ensure that her words would be heard by the nearby guests, but not by the entire room. Stella swirled the expensive wine in her glass while looking me up and down before sneering. "I thought you couldn't afford a plane ticket back here. Is this dress a knockoff? Or a rental?" I simply offered her a polite smile that did not reach my eyes because I refused to let her see that her insults had landed. I looked past her shoulder to scan the crowded room for the one person whose approval I had once desperately craved above all else. Douglas was standing near the fireplace holding a crystal tumbler of scotch, and for a fleeting second our eyes met across the expanse of the ballroom. The hope that he might show a flicker of regret or welcome was crushed instantly when he deliberately turned his back on me to resume his conversation with a group of bankers. That single gesture of dismissal hurt more than any words Stella could have screamed, because it confirmed that to him I was nothing more than a serving girl who had wandered into the wrong room. The sound of a booming voice drew my attention to the center of the room, where Travis was holding court with a group of potential investors who looked skeptical, but polite. My brother-in-law was sweating profusely in a tuxedo that was slightly too tight for him as he gestured wildly with his hands to emphasize his fabricated achievements. He raised his voice so that even the people in the back of the room could hear his proclamation about the future of the failing company. Travis puffed out his chest with unearned confidence and declared, "I am about to close an exclusive contract with the Julian Group, and our company will soon expand globally." It took every ounce of my self-control not to laugh out loud at the tragic irony of his statement given the dossier I had just read in the car. Stella noticed my amused expression and immediately snapped her fingers to summon a waiter who looked apologetic about the task he had been given. She whispered something sharply into his ear while pointing a manicured finger at the far corner of the room where the shadows swallowed the light. The waiter approached me with his head bowed low and murmured, "Miss Stella has instructed me to escort you to your assigned seat for the evening immediately." I followed him away from the sparkling chandeliers and the warmth of the main gathering toward a small, undecorated table that had been jammed next to the swinging doors of the kitchen. This was their final attempt to put me in my place by physically separating me from the VIP section, where the family and important guests were seated. I sat down in the drafty corner while the smell of cooking grease wafted over me every time the servers rushed in and out with trays of hors d'oeuvres. From my vantage point in the shadows, I had a perfect view of the stage where their house of cards was about to come crashing down. When the melodious music faded to make way for the important speeches, all attention shifted toward the main stage where the lighting had been dramatically adjusted to highlight the hosts. I sat in the shadows of my exiled corner and tried to make myself as small as possible, while the murmurs of the guests around me began to rise in volume. The distant relatives who had not seen me in years were seated at the table directly in front of mine, and they made absolutely no effort to lower their voices as they dissected my appearance. A cousin wearing too much diamond jewelry leaned over to her mother and whispered loudly enough for half the room to hear, "Is that the pottery girl sitting over there by the kitchen door? She looks so out of place, truly the ugly duckling among swans." I gripped the stem of my water glass until my knuckles turned white because I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me react to their petty cruelty. The room fell silent only when Douglas stepped up to the microphone stand with the confidence of a man who believed he owned the world and everyone in it. He smoothed the lapels of his tuxedo and looked out over the crowd with a beaming smile that never once wavered in my direction. Douglas raised his glass high into the air to command the attention of the room before booming. "I am proud to introduce my eldest daughter, Stella, and son-in-law, Travis, the only worthy heirs to this legacy." The applause that followed was thunderous and practiced, as if the guests knew exactly what was expected of them in exchange for the expensive wine they were drinking. Stella stood up from the head table with a practiced grace, smoothing her gold-sequined dress as she bowed deeply to the adoring crowd like a queen acknowledging her subjects. She basked in the validation for a long moment before turning her head sharply to lock eyes with me across the dimly lit ballroom. Her expression was a mixture of triumph and malice as she silently communicated that I would never belong in this circle of power and influence, no matter how hard I tried. I watched her enjoy her fabricated moment of glory and felt a strange sense of calm, because I knew that the higher she climbed, the harder she was about to fall. The heavy double doors at the main entrance suddenly swung open with a resounding crash that echoed off the high ceilings and cut through the applause like a knife. The chatter died instantly as every head in the room turned to see who had dared to interrupt the coronation of the family heirs. Julian stood in the doorway framed by the night sky, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than the entire party budget, radiating an aura of cold, untouchable power. He did not smile or acknowledge the staff who rushed to greet him, but instead scanned the room with predatory precision until he found the target he was looking for. The silence that descended upon the room was absolute and terrifying as the guests realized that someone of true consequence had arrived. Travis was the first one to break the paralysis because he had spent months stalking this man's schedule in a desperate attempt to save his own skin. He grabbed Stella's arm with a force that made her wince and pointed a shaking finger toward the entrance while his eyes nearly bulged out of his head. Travis practically hyperventilated as he whispered frantically to his wife, "That is Chairman Julian. Am I seeing things? He actually came here." The realization rippled through the family table like an electric shock as they understood that the most elusive investor in the country was standing in their foyer. Douglas dropped his facade of dignity immediately and practically shoved a waiter out of his way to get to the floor first. Stella and Travis abandoned their champagne glasses on the table, spilling expensive liquid onto the tablecloths as they scrambled to follow him. The three of them rushed toward the entrance with an embarrassing lack of decorum, their faces flushed with greed and the desperate hope that their fortunes were about to change. They lined up in front of Julian like eager schoolchildren jostling each other to be the first one to extend a hand to the VIP guest. I watched from my dark corner and took a slow sip of water, knowing that the man they were rushing to greet was the same man who had held my hand in the car just 10 minutes ago. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as every eye was glued to Julian's every step while he walked through the parting crowd like a king entering his court. Douglas stood at the front of the receiving line with his hand extended and a desperate smile plastered on his face, ready to welcome the man who could save his legacy. However, Julian did not slow his pace for even a fraction of a second as he walked right past my father without even acknowledging his existence. The smile froze on Douglas's face and then shattered into confusion as Travis also stepped forward to offer a greeting, only to be completely ignored by the man he had idolized for months. The guests watched in stunned silence as the most powerful man in the room walked past the VIP table and headed straight toward the dark, drafty corner near the kitchen. I remained seated with my hands folded in my lap until Julian stopped directly in front of my small table and extended his hand toward me with a look of absolute adoration. He ignored the gasps that echoed through the ballroom as he helped me to my feet and then bowed his head to press a gentle kiss to my knuckles. The intimacy of the gesture was a deliberate declaration of war against anyone who had treated me as less than royalty. Julian kept my hand firmly tucked in the crook of his arm as he turned to face the room and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. "I apologize for being late, Riley. It is far too noisy in here, and this environment does not suit your elegance at all." Travis looked as if he had been physically struck, his face draining of all color as he stumbled toward us, with his hands shaking uncontrollably. He looked back and forth between the billionaire investor and the sister-in-law he had mocked just minutes ago, unable to process the reality unfolding before him. He tried to salvage the situation, but his voice cracked with panic when he asked, "Sir Julian, do you actually know my sister-in-law? There must be some terrible misunderstanding here, because she is just an estranged relative." Julian's expression instantly hardened into a mask of cold fury as he looked at the man who had bragged about a non-existent contract. He did not bother to lower his voice because he wanted every single investor in the room to hear the verdict he was about to deliver. Julian tightened his grip on my hand and replied, "There is no misunderstanding at all. And by the way, I am officially rejecting your funding application because of the fraudulent data and the incompetent management I found in your files." The accusation hung in the air like a guillotine blade before dropping, causing a ripple of shocked whispers to break out among the guests. Douglas looked as though he was having a heart attack, but Stella reacted with the screeching denial of someone whose entire world was collapsing. She stomped her foot on the floor like a petulant child and pointed a trembling finger at me. Her face twisted into an ugly mask of rage. She screamed across the silent room, "That is impossible. She is nothing but a pathetic failure who plays with mud all day. How could a man like you possibly know her? You are being deceived by her lies." Douglas recovered from his shock enough to join the attack, desperate to regain control of the narrative before his reputation was destroyed. He stepped forward with his fists clenched and barked an order at me as if I were still the obedient teenager he had kicked out of his house. His voice boomed with misplaced authority as he shouted, "Riley, tell the truth right now before you embarrass this family any further with your manipulative schemes. Tell him you are nobody." I looked at my father and sister, seeing them for the first time not as giants who controlled my destiny, but as small, frightened people clinging to a crumbling ledge. I did not need to say a word, because Julian stepped forward to deliver the final crushing blow that would silence them forever. He looked at Stella with profound disgust and then swept his gaze over the stunned audience to deliver the truth. Julian spoke with a calm, deadly precision. "The pottery studio owned by this woman generates double the annual profit of your dying company. Let's see who the real failure is now." The revelation hit the room with the force of a physical blow, causing the guests to audibly gasp as they realized the magnitude of the mistake the family had made. Stella opened her mouth to scream again, but no sound came out, her face turning a blotchy red as the humiliation washed over her. Travis slumped against a nearby table as if his legs had given out, while Douglas stared at me with eyes wide with horror and regret. Julian did not give them a chance to recover or beg. He simply turned his back on them and guided me toward the exit, leaving them drowning in the wreckage of their own arrogance. The next morning, news of the scandal at the birthday party spread through the business world faster than a Category 10 hurricane tearing through a coastal town. I sat at my kitchen island with a cup of steaming coffee and watched the financial news channel on the television as the reporters discussed the spectacular implosion of a once respected family dynasty. The ticker symbol for Douglas's company turned a violent shade of red the moment the opening bell rang on Wall Street, signaling a mass exodus of shareholders who were desperate to cut their losses. The stock price plummeted in a vertical line that looked less like a market correction and more like a death sentence for the business my father had prioritized over his own children. It became immediately clear that the other investors had pulled their capital not just because of the fraudulent numbers Julian had exposed, but because they were terrified of crossing the man who had publicly denounced the company. My phone began to vibrate incessantly against the marble countertop, interrupting the morning silence with the persistence of a siren warning of an approaching disaster. The screen displayed the name of the sister who had spent her entire life trying to make me feel small, but I let it ring for a long moment before finally sliding my finger across the glass to answer. Stella did not even wait for me to say hello before she launched into a hysterical tirade that was so loud I had to pull the device away from my ear. Her voice was a mixture of sobbing and screaming as she tried to blame me for the consequences of her own arrogance and incompetence. She shrieked through the receiver with a complete lack of self-awareness. "Are you happy now, you selfish brat? You ruined everything we built. Tell your boyfriend to fix this mess or I swear I will destroy you." I listened to her breakdown with a sense of detachment that surprised me, realizing that her tears were not for the damage she had caused, but for the lifestyle she was about to lose. I leaned back in my chair and took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch out until her sobbing subsided enough for me to speak. I kept my voice perfectly calm and devoid of the sympathy she was desperately trying to extract from me. I replied to her accusation with a question that cut straight through her victim mentality. "You called me a disgrace yesterday. Remember, why are you begging a disgrace for help now? Go bankrupt in silence, Stella." I ended the call before she could scream another word, but the phone lit up again almost immediately with the contact information of the man who had birthed me but never acted like a father. I accepted the call because I knew this would be the last time I ever spoke to him, and I wanted to hear exactly what he had to say for himself after the humiliation of the previous night. Douglas did not offer a single word of apology or regret for the way he had treated me, nor did he acknowledge the fact that he had kicked me out of his house a year ago. Instead, he adopted the same authoritarian tone he had used to control me during my childhood, barking orders, as if he still held some imaginary power over my life. He demanded with absolute arrogance, "You listen to me right now. I order you to bring Julian home for dinner immediately so we can fix this contract. Do not forget who raised you." I looked across the table at Julian, who was calmly buttering a piece of toast while listening to the entire conversation on the speakerphone I had activated. He paused his movements and simply shook his head with a look of profound disappointment, confirming that he had absolutely no intention of ever doing business with such a man. I realized in that moment that Douglas would never change because his ego was too large to allow him to see anyone else as a human being worthy of respect. I took a deep breath and delivered the final verdict that severed the last remaining thread connecting me to that toxic house. I spoke slowly and clearly so that he would never misunderstand my position again. "You kicked me out a year ago for being worthless. I am not your daughter anymore. I am your competitor." I pressed the red icon to end the call without waiting for his reaction, silencing his voice mid-sentence and reclaiming my peace in a single motion. I immediately navigated through the settings menu of my phone and blocked every single number associated with my father, my sister, and my brother-in-law. A wave of immense relief washed over me as I set the phone back down on the table, feeling lighter than I had in 20 years. It felt as though a malignant tumor had finally been surgically removed from my life, leaving me free to heal and grow without the poison of their expectations. Just 1 month after that fateful night, the social order of those who had once looked down on me had collapsed completely like a row of dominoes falling in slow motion. The destruction of my father's legacy was swift and absolute because the business world has no patience for fraud or the people who perpetrate it. Douglas's company was officially declared bankrupt by the courts, forcing the immediate liquidation of every single asset he had spent his life accumulating to maintain his fragile ego. He was compelled to sell the magnificent Newport villa where he had humiliated me just weeks before, watching helplessly as strangers walked through the halls to appraise his possessions for auction. My father was forced to move into a cramped and dilapidated apartment complex on the outskirts of the city, where the heating worked intermittently and the walls were thin enough to hear his neighbors arguing. The country club memberships and the fair-weather friends vanished overnight, leaving him to spend his remaining years in a solitude that was entirely of his own making. The downfall of the golden couple was even more spectacular and public, as the stress of financial ruin turned their toxic relationship into a battlefield. Stella and Travis filed for divorce amidst a storm of accusations and public screaming matches that became the gossip of the entire town. They fought viciously over the few remaining scraps of their wealth, dragging their personal failures into the light for everyone to witness with morbid curiosity. To make matters worse, both of them found themselves permanently blacklisted by every reputable company in the state because no one wanted to hire managers with a history of falsifying financial records. Stella was forced to trade her designer gowns for a uniform at a local diner serving tables to the very people she used to sneer at, while Travis moved back in with his parents in disgrace. While their world was crumbling into dust, my life was blossoming into something more beautiful than I had ever dared to imagine during those dark days in the warehouse. Julian and I organized an intimate engagement ceremony on a private stretch of coastline, where the golden sunset painted the sky in colors that matched the joy in my heart. There were no flashing cameras or desperate attempts to impress wealthy investors, just the soothing sound of the ocean waves and the genuine laughter of the people who truly loved us. I looked around the circle of friends who had stood by me when I had nothing, including the people who helped me stack boxes and mix clay, and I realized that this was what true wealth looked like. Julian slipped a simple but elegant diamond ring onto my finger and whispered promises of a future built on mutual respect and unwavering support. I want to share a few important lessons with all of you who have followed my journey from a discarded daughter to a successful woman. The first and most important lesson is that you must never allow the prejudices of others to define your worth as a human being. People will try to project their own insecurities onto you, but the sweetest revenge is not screaming back at them. It is simply living a life so happy and successful that their opinions become irrelevant. I learned that my value did not come from my father's approval or my sister's envy, but from the passion and hard work I poured into my own dreams every single day. The second lesson is a difficult truth that took me years to accept, which is that sharing the same blood does not give someone a free pass to be toxic. You must have the courage to cut the cords with family members who hold you back or mistreat you, because keeping them in your life will only poison your potential. Family should be a safe harbor that protects you from the storm, not the source of the storm itself, and you have every right to sail away to calmer waters. I found my real family in the friends who supported me and the partner who cherished me, proving that love is a choice rather than an obligation. Thank you so much to everyone who has listened to my story and supported me through this retelling of the most pivotal moment of my life. I hope that my experience gives you the strength to stand up for yourself and chase your dreams, regardless of what others might say about you. If you have ever been looked down upon by your own family or struggled to find your own path, please share your story in the comments section below because I would love to read them.